Lesson 24, Basic Looping. Well, what's a loop? A loop allows you to repeat a section of code for each record in the dataset. The basic loop that we're going to start with is called a for next loop. The for next loop always starts with the keyword for, and it ends with the keyword next, and then you typically have many lines of code that you want to repeat between those two lines of code. Very, very powerful concept. You'll be using it again and again and again. Let's get started. All right, so we're going to build our first loop. I've arranged the window here so that way we can see Excel on the left and we can see the VBA window on the right. First thing you have to do is choose a variable that we're going to use. This variable is called the control variable. So we always start with the word for and then the variable name. Now you can use whatever you like. Because I create loops all of the time, I use the letter I for I, and then we put an equal sign and we say where we want the loop to go. We want the loop to go from, let's say, 1 to 5, for I equals 1 to 5. And then we're going to have several lines of code, and at the end we're going to have next and then the name of the variable, next I. Now here's what happens as we run this macro. The very first time that we hit the line of code that says for I equals 1 to 5, I starts out being 1. And as all of these lines of code in the middle are run, we can continually use that variable I to know that we're working on row 1. When we get down to next I, Excel adds 1 to I and sees that I is equal to 2, and it checks to see if 2 is greater than the last number here. So of course 2 is not greater than 5. So the control of the macro comes back up here to the first line inside the loop. And we run all of these lines of code again, but this time, of course, we'll be running it with the value of I equals 2. So if we refer to some cell and we use I as the row number, we'll manage to be able to write 2 different rows each time. Let's just do something very, very simple here. Let's do cells I, 1 dot value equals I. And we'll run this loop one line at a time, and we'll take a look at what's happening here in the VBA window and over in the Excel window. So I'm going to be pressing the F8 key, and we start our loop. Okay, now at this point, the variable I, let's set up a watch so we can see what I is. You'll see that the variable I is equal to 1. So this line of code where we say cells I, 1, well, the very first time it's going to be writing to row 1. It's going to say, hey, row 1, column 1, we're going to write the value of 1. So I press F8, and you'll see over on the left-hand side now that we wrote in cell A1 the number 1. All right, simple enough. We're down at the next I. It looks at I, which is currently 1, says if I add 1 to that, will it be greater than 5? And the answer is no. So control goes back up into the loop. But you'll see that this time through the loop, the value of I is equal to 2. So now the line of code is saying, all right, we're going to go to row 2, column 1, and write the value 2 in that cell. So there's the number 2. Run it again, we get the number 3. Run it again, we get the number 4. Run it again, we get the number 5. All right, now interesting point here. At this point, the next is going to say, okay, we're currently at 5. If we add 1 to this, we're going to have 6. And 6 is going to be greater than the number 5. So therefore, I'm going to allow the macro to continue running beyond the loop. Now, something to be aware of and to be very careful of is that the value of I is actually incremented. So if you later use I outside the loop, and frankly I never do, you'll find that it is not 5 where the loop ended. It's actually 1 more. It's 6. All right, so that's the very basic loop. Now this one, I mean, seems incredibly simple. All we're doing is, numbering some records. Usually we'll do something far more interesting than that, but it's certainly easy to do, and you can control where the loop goes from. So I want to go from I to 10, and maybe I don't want to just put I in there. I want to put I raised to the second power. Let's just run this loop straight through. Watch what happens on the left-hand side. And so from 1 to 10, we managed to put the square of that number. So 2 squared is 4, 3 squared is 9, 7 squared is 49, 9 squared is 81, 10 squared is 100. You can see we can do any kind of a calculation there. All right, and so usually what we're doing is as we're going through and looking at each of these rows in the data set, we're trying to make some decision. For example, we could use select case cells I, comma 2, and we can say case apple. And in the case of an apple, we could go to cells I, comma 3. So in other words, column C of this row equals red. Case orange, cells I, comma 3 equals orange. Case banana, copy this now, equals yellow. What else do we have? We have eggplant and cherry. So and cherry, I want to also be red. So back up here, we'll say if it's either apple or cherry. Then we write the word red in there. And we'll put an end select here. All right, so now in this case, we're actually taking a look at each of the values in each row and writing those colors over to column C. Let's run this macro. All right, and very quickly it fills that data in. We'll go back and do that step by step just for the first few. So we go through here. We see that I this time is equal to 1. If I would ask in the immediate window for print cells I, comma 2, we see that it's apple. So as we run through our code here, we should run the code for apple. The next time through, we are in row 2. This time it should be an orange. So that case is not selected. Case orange is selected, and we write the word orange. Each time through the loop, I is getting 1 larger, and we basically have some flow control here that says, all right, we're going to do a different thing based on what values we find in the loop. This is very, very typical. Now, in this particular case, we have a situation where we had 10 rows in Excel, and we hard-coded the loop to use those 10 rows. In real life, we're going to use the loop with the variable called final row. So final row equals cells rows.count, comma 2, because our fruit is in column 2, dot end Excel up dot row. And then instead of hard coding that we're going to go from 1 to 10, we'll say we're going to go from 1 to final row. All right, so let's over here in Excel go back to where we started. All right, we just have some code. When I run this, it's going to figure out that the final row is 10 and fills in all of that data if on a different day I have a different number of records. So we'll just copy some of these records here. And so now today I have 15 records instead of 10 records, and I run this code. It's going to see the final row is 15, and it fills in my data all the way down. All right, very typical situation here. We have some data. We need to add some information based on some rules. We set up the rules once and have the code run again and again and again and again. It doesn't matter how many rows we have. Let me just add some more. So we'll say equal index of B1 colon B3. Press F4. F4. Ran between 1 comma 3. That's just going to put some random data in here. We'll copy it down, 1,000 rows or a few thousand rows, and convert those to values. All right, so now rather than just doing 10 or 15, this same loop on the right-hand side is going to evaluate a couple thousand rows of data. Let's go ahead and run that. Rather than taking a second, it did just take a second. And so we come over here, press N down, and it filled in those colors all the way through 2,000 rows. Now we have 1,000,000 rows in Excel 2007. If you would actually ask for it to evaluate 1,000,000 cells, you will see a delay. That might take 45, 60 seconds for it to go through and do all of those evaluations. But you can see that this loop is very flexible, whether you have a few rows or whether you have thousands of rows. Very quickly it can go through, do those evaluations, run the code again and again and again. So the basic loop, we start with the word for. We have to choose a variable name. This variable name could be called anything. You could use your name. You could say this row. I just use I. That's a very short, easy thing to write. I, going back to the days of Fortran, was typically the loop that used for integers, and so somewhere in my training it was just I. I is what I end up using. Very quick way to be able to go through and run this loop. You can use, as I said, anything you want to do. It's also possible to have a loop within a loop. So we might have sub loop 2 for I equals, let's just go from 5 to 15. And then for j equals, let's go from 5 to 10, cells I comma j dot value equals I times j. Next j, next I. Okay, so this is going to go from row 5 to 15, columns 5, which is E, to j. Let's move over here so we can see this a little bit better. And as we start to run this loop, you see that we're going to be filling in a rectangular range. So there's the top left corner, and then over here in VBA we'll press F8, write in the next number. So we're going through row 5, several different columns, and then we go down to row 6, and then down through row 7, and then down through row 8, adding a calculation each time. I'll just let this go ahead and finish, and you see that very quickly it fills in a rectangular range. This time we're using 2 loops. Again, the point here is this control variable can be anything you want. I used I and j. You could call it this row and this column. This row and this column, frankly, would be much more understandable. But I've gotten to the point where I'm doing loops so frequently, these are my go-to variables. I use I use j. Again, they could be anything that you want. So, very basic loop here. Most of the time, my macros are going to start out figuring where the final row is, and then we're going to loop through and take a look at doing something to each one of those rows. In the next lesson, we're actually going to walk through a real-life situation where we have to go through and look at all the rows. We're going to use these concepts again in a more practical example other than just figuring out the name of some fruit. The basic for next loop. I hope you found this lesson helpful, and thanks for watching.
Looking to advance your career by acquiring new skills? Tired of expensive off-site training programs? Wish you could learn from the best instructors in the industry? Look no further than Live Lessons. Self-paced, personal video instruction by the world's leading technology publishers. Each live lesson comes with a DVD featuring 3 to 4 hours of instructor-led classroom training, sample program code that allows you to work along with your personal instructor, and an example-rich study guide. Live lessons allow you to watch the entire course from start to finish, or navigate directly to any of the individual lessons. You'll literally watch over the shoulder of your instructor as he shows you how to build state-of-the-art applications. Live Lessons, the power of the world's leading technology experts at your fingertips. To learn more, visit mylivelessons.com today.